The hyperspace warning klaxon had been screaming for exactly 47 seconds when Commander Jake Sullivan realized his day was about to get significantly worse. The navigation console in front of him flickered between displaying completely impossible coordinates and what appeared to be a recipe for Martian jambalaya, neither of which seemed particularly helpful for getting out of hyperspace alive. "Come on, you beautiful piece of junk," Jake muttered, slapping the side of the console with the practiced technique of someone who'd been fixing things with percussive maintenance for the better part of a decade. "Don't do this to me now." The Meridian shuddered around him, her hull groaning like an old man getting out of bed. Through the viewports, the familiar blue-white tunnel of hyperspace began to flicker and distort, reality bending in ways that made Jake's eyes water and his breakfast threat a tactical retreat. His cargo manifest floated forgotten beside him, 3 tons of synthetic coffee beans bound for the Kepler station. Not exactly the glamorous life of interstellar commerce he dreamed about as a kid, but it paid the bills and kept him moving through the void where nobody asked too many questions about his past. The ship's AI, affectionately nicknamed STELLA by the previous owner, crackled to life through speakers that had seen better decades. "Jake, I'm detecting massive gravitational anomalies. My sensors are reading." "Well, they're reading poetry now, which can't be right." "Poetry?" Jake's fingers danced across the manual override controls, trying to coax the ship back into normal space before they ended up scattered across 17 different dimensions. "What kind of poetry?" "Mostly limericks, actually. There was a young ship from Nantucket." "Not now, STELLA." The hyperspace tunnel collapsed without warning, spitting the Meridian out into normal space with all the grace of a drunk walrus. Jake's stomach performed several theoretical physics experiments as the artificial gravity struggled to remember which direction was supposed to be down. Through the clearing viewport, a planet rushed toward them with alarming enthusiasm. It was a sickly green-brown marble wrapped in swirling clouds that looked like cosmic coffee stains. Not exactly the picturesque tropical paradise the travel brochures always promised. "Well," Jake said, strapping himself into his crash harness with practiced efficiency, "this is just fantastic. I always wanted a lakefront property, but this is ridiculous." The atmospheric entry turned the Meridian into a screaming meteor, her heat shields glowing cherry red as she carved through the alien atmosphere. Jake fought with the controls, trying to find something resembling level ground on a planet that seemed to consist entirely of swampland and poor life choices. STELLA, give me landing options that don't involve becoming a very expensive crater. Scanning. "Jake, I'm afraid your options are limited to really bad and spectacularly catastrophic." "I'll take really bad for 500, Alex." The ship hit the first layer of canopy, with a sound like the universe's largest drum set being thrown down a staircase. Ancient trees, the size of skyscrapers, swatted at them with branches thick as subway tunnels, each impact sending shockwaves through the hull that made Jake's teeth rattle. They crashed through layer after layer of vegetation, each level a different ecosystem unto itself. Bioluminescent vines sparked and flashed as they were severed by the ship's passage, creating a light show that would have been beautiful if Jake hadn't been too busy trying not to die to appreciate it. The Meridian finally came to rest in what Jake generously classified as a landing, though it bore more resemblance to a controlled crash into a particularly soft swamp. The ship listed 30 degrees to starboard, her nose buried in something that glowed faintly blue and smelled like low tide mixed with regret. Jake hung in his harness for a moment, taking inventory of his various body parts and finding them all still attached in roughly the correct locations. STLA damage report. Where would you like me to start? The good news is we're not dead. The bad news is, well, everything else. Steam hissed from ruptured coolant lines, filling the cabin with fog that tasted metallic and made Jake's eyes water. Emergency lighting bathed everything in hellish red, because apparently the ship's designers believed that near-death experiences should have proper ambience. Jake unstrapped himself and immediately discovered that the artificial gravity was operating on what could charitably be called suggestions. He stumbled to the main console, where readouts flickered between English, Mandarin, and what appeared to be interpretive dance notation. Life support. Marginal but functional. Air recycling is working, but I wouldn't plan any dinner parties. Engines. What engines? I think they're having a philosophical discussion with some trees about a quarter-mile that way. Jake sighed and pulled on his emergency suit, a piece of engineering that promised to keep him alive in hostile environments, while making him look like an inflatable advertisement for questionable fashion choices. The helmet's heads-up display flickered to life, painting the swamp outside in various shades of infrared disappointment. The airlock cycled with a wheeze that suggested it was considering early retirement. Jake stepped out onto what had probably been the Meridian's cargo ramp before it developed aspirations of becoming abstract art. His boots squelched into something that might have been mud if mud glowed softly and occasionally bubbled. The swamp stretched in every direction, a vast network of waterways that wove between massive tree trunks like liquid highways. The air shimmered with humidity and microscopic life that his suit's sensors couldn't quite classify. Everything seemed to pulse with its own internal rhythm, as if the entire ecosystem was one massive organism breathing in slow motion. Well, STELLA, Jake said, activating his external communications. I've seen worse vacation spots. Remember that stopover on Rigel 7? The one where everything tried to eat us. The very same, at least here the scenery has mood lighting. As if responding to his words, patterns of light began to flow through the water around the ship, spiraling outward in complex geometries that hurt to look at directly. Jake had seen bioluminescence before, but this was different, organized, almost purposeful. That's when he spotted the smoke. About 200 meters to the northwest, a thin column of vapor rose from behind a cluster of trees that looked like they'd been designed by someone with serious commitment issues regarding the concept of up. The smoke was too straight, too regular to be natural. STELLA, you picking up any other technological signatures? Affirmative. Faint power readings bearing 315 degrees. Could be debris from another ship. Jake checked his suit's power levels and environmental systems. Everything was green, or at least green enough to risk a short hike through an alien swamp that probably considered him a delightful addition to the local food web. Keep monitoring the ship's systems. If something big and hungry shows up, start playing death metal at maximum volume. Wouldn't classical music be more soothing? STELLA. Anything that gets soothed by Beethoven probably isn't the kind of predator I'm worried about. The trek through the swamp proved immediately educational in ways Jake hadn't requested. His first step off solid ground plunged his right leg knee-deep into something that felt like pudding mixed with regret. Extracting himself required a combination of physics. The woman with the pointed ears had introduced herself as Lyra, which Jake thought was a perfectly reasonable name for someone who looked like she'd stepped out of a fantasy novel and into his particular brand of cosmic bad luck. She'd been surprisingly calm about waking up on an unknown swamp planet next to a complete stranger, which either spoke well of her mental resilience or poorly of the places she usually found herself. So, Jake said, helping her climb out of the escape pod while trying not to slip into the luminescent muck himself, I'm guessing this wasn't your intended destination either. Lyra brushed something glowing off her sleeve with the casual ease of someone accustomed to alien biology. My navigation system experienced what you might call a catastrophic disagreement with local space-time. I was attempting to reach the Kepler station when... Kepler station, that's where I was headed to. What are the odds? Mathematically speaking, either incredibly small or we're dealing with some form of gravitational anomaly that's been pulling ships out of hyperspace. Given our current circumstances, I'm inclined toward the latter. Jake had to admit he liked her pragmatic approach to interdimensional transportation failures. Most people would be having hysterics by now, but Lyra seemed to be treating their situation like an interesting puzzle rather than a death sentence. Well, since we're both members of the Unplanned Planetary Visitation Club, maybe we should pool our resources. I've got a ship that's mostly intact and a cargo hold full of synthetic coffee beans. How about you? Lyra gestured toward her escape pod, which Jake now noticed was considerably more sophisticated than it had appeared from the outside. The interior gleamed with what looked like living metal, surfaces that shifted and adapted to optimize space and function. Emergency supplies for 2 weeks, a molecular fabricator, and a rather comprehensive xenobiology database. Also, my pod's sensors are still functional. A molecular fabricator. You mean one of those things that can turn raw matter into anything you need? Within limits, yes. Though I should warn you that Solani fabricators have rather specific ideas about what constitutes proper nutrition. I hope you're not opposed to foods that glow. Jake laughed, splashing through the bioluminescent water toward a cluster of root formations that looked stable enough to support a temporary shelter. Lady, after 3 years of synthetic rations that taste like cardboard soaked in regret, I'm willing to try anything that doesn't actively try to eat me first. That's an admirably flexible attitude. Though I should mention that determining what might try to eat us should probably be our first priority. As if summoned by her words, something large moved through the water nearby, creating ripples that disturbed the light patterns in ways that made Jake's eyes hurt. Whatever it was stayed submerged, but the displacement suggested something roughly the size of a small spacecraft. Right, Jake said, unconsciously checking that his sidearm was still secured to his belt. Shelter first, xenobiology lesson second, trying not to become the local cuisine third. They spent the next several hours creating what Jake generously termed their luxury swamp resort, using debris from both vessels and some creative engineering. Lyra's molecular fabricator proved invaluable, transforming twisted metal and organic matter into structural supports that actually seemed to improve over time, adapting to stress and environmental conditions. Your technology is remarkable, Jake said, watching a fabricated beam adjust its density to better support their makeshift platform. Is all Solani equipment this adaptive? We prefer to work with natural processes rather than against them. Your human engineering is impressively robust, but it seems to assume the universe is actively hostile. In my experience, that's a pretty safe assumption. Lyra paused in her work, tilting her head in a way that made her elongated ears catch the ambient light. You know, that might explain why humans are so fond of explosions as problem-solving tools. Hey, explosions are an art form. You just have to know which end to point away from yourself. Their philosophical discussion of demolition aesthetics was interrupted by a sound that Jake's trained ear immediately classified as large, carnivorous, and uncomfortably close. Something was moving through the vegetation around their improvised camp, disturbing the bioluminescent displays in patterns that suggested it was circling them. Please tell me your xenobiology database has a section on things that go bump in the night on swamp planets, Jake whispered, drawing his plasma pistol. Lyra consulted a device that projected a holographic display showing local life sign readings. I'm detecting something approximately 4 meters in length, with multiple appendages and what appears to be a distributed nervous system. The good news is that its biochemistry suggests it's primarily a scavenger. And the bad news: scavengers sometimes decide to make their own fresh meat. The creature chose that moment to emerge from the undergrowth, and Jake immediately decided that whoever had been in charge of designing local wildlife had possessed either a twisted sense of humor or serious issues with tentacle-based anatomy. It looked like someone had crossed an octopus with an alligator and then given the result anger management problems. Okay, Jake said, keeping his weapon trained on the thing while it tested the structural integrity of their platform with exploratory tentacles. On a scale of 1 to 10, how much trouble are we in? I'd estimate a solid 7, escalating rapidly toward 9 if it decides we're edible. The creature seemed to be conducting its own threat assessment, its multiple eyes focusing on them with the calculating intelligence Jake had learned to fear in predators. Then it opened what he assumed was its mouth, revealing rows of teeth that looked like they'd been designed by someone who took dental work very seriously. "Any suggestions from the xenobiology department?" Jake asked, keeping his voice steady despite the creature's apparent decision that they looked delicious. "Actually, yes. Most swamp predators are territorial rather than truly aggressive. If we can convince it we're not worth the effort." Jake fired a warning shot that illuminated the surrounding area in plasma-bright relief. The creature jerked backward, its tentacles recoiling from the heat and light. For a moment, Jake thought it might retreat. Instead, it roared with a sound like an air raid siren having an existential crisis and launched itself at their platform. What followed was what Jake would later describe as an interpretive dance of mutual annoyance performed on a stage made of questionable life choices. The creature was fast and surprisingly intelligent, using its tentacles to test their defenses while staying mostly out of range of Jake's plasma fire. Lyra proved remarkably calm under pressure, using her pod's defensive systems to create fields of electromagnetic interference that seemed to confuse the creature's sensory organs. "It's trying to circle around to our blind spot," Lyra called out, manipulating her controls with the focused precision of someone who'd clearly dealt with hostile wildlife before. "I noticed. Any chance your database has information on local predator psychology?" Most species 3 weeks into what Jake had taken to calling their extended nature retreat from hell, he discovered that Lyra hummed when she concentrated. It was a soft, melodic sound that seemed to harmonize with the swamp's own mysterious rhythms, and it had become as much a part of his daily routine as checking the atmospheric processors and trying not to fall off their increasingly elaborate raft home. The improbable, as Jake had christened their floating fortress, had grown considerably since their first desperate night of construction. What had started as a simple platform cobbled together from crashed debris now resembled something between a houseboat and a small research station, complete with living quarters, a workshop, and what Lyra diplomatically referred to as Jake's explosive hobby corner. "I still think we should have named it something more dignified," Lyra said, adjusting the bioluminescent cultivation tanks that provided both food and light for their floating home. "The Resilient, perhaps, or the Phoenix." "Phoenix implies we rose from ashes," Jake replied, welding another support beam into place with a plasma torch that had definitely not been designed for construction work. "We more like." Belly flopped from space and decided to make the best of it. The improbable captures that spirit perfectly. Lyra's ears twitched in what Jake had learned was the Solani equivalent of an eye roll. Over the past weeks, he'd become surprisingly adept at reading her expressions, discovering that pointed ears were remarkably expressive when it came to conveying opinions about his questionable life choices. Their morning routine had developed its own comfortable rhythm. Jake would check the perimeter sensors, while Lyra tended to their growing collection of domesticated swamp organisms. Her xenobiology expertise had proven invaluable in identifying which local life forms could be safely cultivated for food materials, or in one memorable case, entertainment. "The filtration algae are responding well to the mineral supplements," Lyra reported, her hands glowing faintly as she worked with organisms that seemed to pulse in response to her touch. "We should have clean water for another month at least." "Good, because I tried boiling swamp water yesterday and it started humming back at me. I don't think that's supposed to happen." "Most of the microorganisms here are surprisingly sophisticated. They communicate through bioelectrical fields and chemical signals that create complex networks throughout the entire ecosystem." Jake paused in his welding to look out at the swamp, where patterns of light continued their endless dance through the water. You mean the whole place is basically one giant brain? More like a distributed consciousness. Individual components that work together to create something larger than the sum of their parts. Great, we're living inside a thinking swamp. That's not ominous at all. Their conversation was interrupted by the distinctive sound of their early warning system, a collection of modified sonic buoys that Jake had rigged to detect large moving objects in the water. The particular harmony of tones meant something big was approaching from the northwest, probably too large to be one of the usual predators that had learned to give the improbable a respectful berth. "Contact bearing 320, Jake announced, dropping into the tactical mindset that had kept him alive through more hostile encounters than he cared to count. "Range approximately 500 meters and closing." Lyra consulted her sensors, frowning at readings that seemed to shift and pulse with their own internal logic. "It's massive, roughly the size of your original ship, but the biosignatures are unusual." "Unusual how?" "Well, for starters, it appears to be mostly plant matter, but it's moving with purpose rather than drifting, and the electromagnetic patterns suggest a nervous system of some kind." Jake grabbed his plasma rifle and moved to the platform's edge, scanning the water for signs of their approaching visitor. "Please tell me it's not carnivorous." "Actually, the biochemical markers suggest it's primarily interested in decay and decomposition. It's probably attracted to the metal debris from our ships, so it wants to eat our house." "Possibly, though given the intelligence we've observed in this ecosystem, it might simply be curious about the unusual additions to its environment." The creature that emerged from the depths a few minutes later definitely qualified as unusual by anyone's standards. It looked like someone had crossbred a whale with a forest, then given the result architectural ambitions. Massive root-like appendages stretched beneath the water, while the surface broke around what appeared to be an entire ecosystem of smaller organisms living symbiotically on its back. "Okay," Jake said, keeping his weapon ready but not actively threatening. "That's either the most beautiful thing I've ever seen or the most terrifying. I'm genuinely not sure which." The creature approached their platform slowly, its movements deliberate and careful. As it drew closer, Jake could see that what he'd taken for random growths on its surface were actually organized structures, living architecture that pulsed with the same bioluminescent patterns they'd observed throughout the swamp. "It's trying to communicate," Lyra breathed, her own bioluminescence responding to the creature's light displays in complex patterns that hurt Jake's eyes to follow directly. "You can understand it." "Not understand exactly, but I'm receiving impressions. Curiosity mostly, and something like amusement. It thinks we're funny. More like endearing, the way you might find a small animal's attempts at complex behavior charming." Jake lowered his rifle, suddenly feeling slightly insulted. "We've built a perfectly functional floating habitat. That's not small animal behavior." The creature's response was a cascade of light patterns that seemed to ripple with what could only be described as laughter. Several of the smaller organisms on its back began producing sounds that, while not quite musical, definitely had comedic timing. "I think it agrees with you," Lyra said, her own expression caught between wonder and barely suppressed mirth. "But it also seems to think our construction techniques are quaint." "Quaint? This platform has survived 3 major storms, 2 predator attacks, and Jake's cooking. There's nothing quaint about that level of engineering excellence." As if responding to his protest, one of the bioluminescent panels Jake had welded into place the previous day chose that moment to fall off and splash into the water. The creature's light display immediately shifted to what was unmistakably the visual equivalent of polite applause. "I'm starting to take this personally," Jake muttered. Lyra placed a gentle hand on his arm, her touch warm and oddly comforting. "I think it's offering to help. The electromagnetic patterns suggest it wants to show us something." Show us what? Better construction techniques, possibly. It seems to think our habitat could be improved. Jake looked around at the improbable, taking in the mismatched panels, jury-rigged systems, and the 3 different places where he'd had to reinforce the structure with what were essentially high-tech duct tape equivalents. Okay, I'll admit there's room for improvement. What followed was the strangest construction project Jake had ever been involved in, and that included the time he'd helped build a communications relay inside an active volcano. The creature, which Lyra had started calling the Architect, demonstrated construction techniques that seemed to violate several fundamental laws of physics, while making perfect sense within the context of an ecosystem that treated matter and energy as interchangeable building materials. Instead of welding metal, the architect showed them how to encourage materials to grow together, creating bonds that were stronger than any mechanical fastening. Rather than importing resources, it demonstrated how to cultivate what they needed from the swamp itself, transforming raw organic matter into specialized building materials through processes that looked like 4 months after their unscheduled arrival. Jake woke up to the sound of Lyra singing in harmony with what appeared to be a small choir of bioluminescent jellyfish. This had become so normal that he barely registered the impossibility of it anymore, which he took as either a sign of successful adaptation or complete psychological breakdown. Given that he felt happier than he had in years, he was leaning toward adaptation. Morning concert started early today, he said, stretching in the living bed that had grown itself around his preferred sleeping position over the past weeks. The swamp's version of furniture was disturbingly comfortable once you got used to the fact that it occasionally adjusted itself while you slept. The Harmony jellyfish are excited about something, Lyra replied, her voice carrying the melodic undertones that had become as familiar as breathing. They've been signaling to the deep-water conductors all night. Jake rolled out of bed and padded to their observation deck, a graceful curve of living wood and bioluminescent panels that had somehow known exactly how he liked to watch the sunrise. The improbable had become less of a raft and more of a symbiotic organism, responding to their needs in ways that still occasionally surprised him. Any idea what's got them so worked up? Lyra joined him at the railing, her elongated ears twitching as she processed sounds beyond human hearing. Something's coming, something big from outside the system. Jake felt his old military instincts kick in, automatically cataloging defensive options before remembering that this wasn't a battlefield anymore. The swamp had taught him that not every unknown contact was a threat, though 4 months of relative peace had made him almost forget what real danger felt like. Multiple ships. The pattern suggests a search formation. They spent the morning monitoring communications frequencies. Jake's salvaged equipment now seamlessly integrated with Lyra's more sophisticated systems. When they finally intercepted a clear signal, it was broadcasting in standard on emergency frequencies. This is Federation Search Vessel Perseverance calling any survivors of Hyperspace Incident 47 Alpha. Please respond on any frequency. Jake and Lyra looked at each other, the moment carrying weight neither of them had expected. Rescue had been theoretical for so long that its actual arrival felt surreal. That's a Solani Federation call sign, Lyra said quietly. They came looking for me. Should we answer? The question hung between them, loaded with implications neither wanted to examine too closely. Jake realized he'd been avoiding this moment, not just the arrival of rescue, but the conversation it would inevitably bring. Jake, Lyra began, her voice careful in the way it got when she was working through complex emotional calculations. What happens when they find us? I suppose that depends on whether they're the shooting first and asking questions later type, or the diplomatic coffee and paperwork type. The Solani Federation and human governments aren't exactly on friendly terms. Trade agreements, yes, but cultural exchange is limited. Jake nodded, having suspected as much. 4 months of close partnership had made it easy to forget that their species were barely acquainted on a governmental level. Personal relationships were one thing, politics were considerably more complicated. "Well," he said, making a decision that surprised him with its clarity, "let's see what kind of diplomatic incident we can create." They composed a response that carefully identified both their species and their cooperative survival situation, broadcasting it on multiple frequencies to ensure maximum confusion among whoever was listening. Jake couldn't help but grin at the thought of some poor communications officer trying to explain to their superiors why a human and a Solani were transmitting joint status reports from an uncharted planet. The response came within hours, and it brought complications Jake hadn't fully anticipated. "This is Commander Thessarian of the Perseverance Asterisk. Solani citizen Lyra, you are ordered to prepare for immediate extraction. Human vessel, maintain your position and do not interfere with Federation operations." "Well, that's friendly," Jake muttered. "I'm feeling very welcomed by our potential rescuers." Lyra's expression had shifted to something Jake had never seen before. A careful diplomatic mask that reminded him she came from a culture with its own military traditions and political complexities. "They're treating this as a hostage situation," she said. "Standard protocol assumes any human-Solani interaction is potentially coercive." "Coercive? We've been building furniture together." "They don't know that. From their perspective, I've been missing for months and am now broadcasting alongside a member of a species known for aggressive territorial expansion." Jake felt something cold settle in his stomach. "So they think I kidnapped you. Or worse." Interspecies incidents have historically not ended well for either side. The implications hit Jake like a plasma blast to the gut. Rescue wasn't going to be a happy reunion. It was going to be a diplomatic crisis with him as the primary suspect and Lyra as the victim. Even if they explained the truth, would anyone believe that two strangers from different species had not only survived together, but had actually come to care for each other? "There's something else," Lyra said, her voice growing quieter. "Federation protocols regarding contact with human military personnel are restrictive." "How restrictive?" "I would likely be quarantined for debriefing and cultural decontamination. The assumption being that extended contact with human perspectives might compromise my objectivity regarding Federation policies." Jake stared out at the swamp that had become home, watching the light patterns flow through the water in their endless, beautiful dance. The ecosystem that had nearly killed them had become the most peaceful place he'd ever lived, and the alien woman who had been a complete stranger had become the most important person in his universe. So rescue means separation. Unless... Lyra trailed off, then straightened with an expression Jake had learned to associate with her most audacious ideas. "Jake, what do you know about diplomatic immunity?" "Enough to know it usually doesn't apply to crashed cargo pilots. But it might apply to the first human-Solani research partnership, studying a previously unknown form of ecosystem intelligence." Jake blinked, his mind racing through the implications. "You want to claim we're conducting official research?" "We are conducting research. The swamp's distributed consciousness is unprecedented in xenobiological literature. The symbiotic relationships, the responsive architecture, the communication networks, it's revolutionary. And if we're official researchers, then separation would compromise the integrity of our ongoing studies. Scientific partnerships transcend political boundaries, especially when dealing with discoveries of this magnitude." Jake grinned, recognizing the same audacious brilliance that had gotten them through 4 months of impossible survival. "You want to turn our vacation from hell into a diplomatic first contact mission." "Exactly, though I prefer to think of it as recognizing what it already was." They spent the next several hours preparing what Jake privately dubbed Operation Academic Shield, converting their survival records into research documentation and their improvised solutions into groundbreaking xenobiological discoveries. It wasn't even a lie. Their partnership really had produced insights that neither species had achieved independently. When the Federation ships arrived the next day, they found not a hostage situation but a functioning research station staffed by two scientists whose work was too valuable to